Welcome into the Postgame show. Elijah Campbell here with you, rolling from 3 up until 6. Going solo with you again today. No Jay Phillips. He will be back Thursday. And, fun programming note, we will not have a show tomorrow because of the baseball game, South Carolina and Davidson, and that game leading up to the mega matchup tomorrow night at CLA. So the Postgame show will have a one-day hiatus before Jay is back, and Jay and I will be broadcasting in from 3 to 6 on Thursday. Whole lot to get into. I have some final baseball thoughts from the Clemson series before we finally put it to bed, and also have some basketball thoughts. Obviously, the SEC Women's Basketball Awards were announced this morning as a lead up into the SEC Women's Tournament, which is going to be this week. That one actually does start tomorrow. We have the two, I don't want to call them play-in games because everybody's in the SEC, but they play into Thursday. 12 seed Georgia and 12 seed Kentucky and 13 seed Georgia play tomorrow at 11, and then 11 seed Florida play 14 seeded Missouri 25 minutes after that. So with the SEC tournament starting tomorrow on the women's side, the superlatives were announced today, and I'll get into that actually here very shortly because I have some gripe, not a ton. I don't like ripping on the awards too much, but there is one thing that I would change. We'll get into that in just a second. But first, I want to get into our poll question of the day in terms of putting a bow on the baseball series. The poll question of the day was kind of meant to do that, but just to see where everybody is, where the fan base is, how everybody's feeling about the series, maybe moving on forward. And the question of the day is, what's the biggest takeaway from the Carolina-Clemson baseball series? Option 1, too many left on base. 2, pitching was a surprise. That's a typo on me. That's my bad. Unprofessional. The pitching was a surprise is what it's supposed to be. 3, concerned by sweep. Or 4, encouraged despite the sweep. And a resounding 79.9% say too many left on base. And that ultimately is the story. You can still say that there's not a lot to know yet about this team because obviously large sample size against lesser opponents. This is your first crack against a legit national title contending type team in Clemson. And you kept it to 1 run in both games, which is good. But it is concerning that you did leave 22 stranded in those 2 games, and that ultimately is what cost you in both. Because it wasn't like, it was 18 stranded in the first game, only 4 in the second. It was almost an even split. 12 stranded on Saturday at Seger Park. 10 runners stranded on base on Sunday in the upstate. That's pretty concerning. 75.9%. And it's a decent sample size here with 187 votes. And the second at 15.5% is they're concerned by the sweep. 5% are encouraged despite being swept. And 3.2% say the pitching was a surprise as the biggest takeaway that they had. I thought Donnie at Donnie Lucas 18 on Twitter comments and said, my biggest takeaway for me was inability to put good at-bats together when they mattered. Call it hitting approach or hitting style, but you have to get base hits sometimes and not try and drive every swing over the wall. Take what's given. And I think that's perfectly fair. Donnie, I think that's a great take because really, when we go to the runners left on base, Mark Kingston even said yesterday, and I'll go to play this for you now because I asked him about what goes into maybe trying to correct these things, maybe why were there so many runners left on base, and this was his response.
Yeah, that's the issue. There's no question about it. And we met as a staff at length today to try to figure out ways to help our guys. We know we can hit. We know we're going to have a good offense. It just hasn't hit on all cylinders yet. And so the left on base is a concern. That was the difference in the ball games. I mean, really, just get one more hit in each game, and we come out 2-0 this weekend. So the disappointing part is we went 0-2, but the encouraging thing is it's fixable. I think there's some things we can do to help our hitters, both mentally and physically, that will get them going back in the right direction and be the kind of offense we think they can be. So it was a punch in the gut, no question about it. But if you take the lessons that you need to learn when you get disappointments like this, it can end up being a positive in the long run, and that's how we're going to approach it.
That's if you learn from it and you're able to maybe adjust hitting with runners in scoring position, be able to bring those guys home, then you can. Yeah, absolutely. Then this could be something we look back on in a couple of months and say this was the turning point maybe of the season where you found out that you can't maybe as Donnie alluded to, try to smack the ball over the wall every time when there's runners in scoring position. Sometimes maybe just getting the ball in play and making the fielders get you out might be. Maybe you can, feel better living with, the players in the field making a great play and putting the fate in their hands, but can't strike out in those positions. And oftentimes, too, just taking what's given to you can be the difference between going into the next inning with 0 runs on the scoreboard and maybe 1 or 2. Even if you just get 1, that would have helped you in both of these games, obviously, considering you lost by 1 run each. I am a little bit surprised that only a small percentage say that the pitching was a surprise, because I thought that was probably the biggest concern. And if you're a Gamecock fan, I think leaving that series saying, hey, we only gave up 8 earned runs in 2 games and gave the bats every opportunity they could to take over and win both of them even, I think is definitely a surprise. But I totally understand looking at the situational hitting and saying, if that doesn't get better, I don't like your chances of advancing very far, whether it be in SEC play or in the postseason. So that's a big concern. You heard Mark in that clip where we were discussing yesterday about stranding runners, and he mentioned talking with coaches that that's one thing they're really going to address. And I followed that up with a question of, how do you practice that? How do you adjust that? Because obviously we have identified the problem here, and that is stranding runners. But how do you go about fixing that? It's hard to replicate that. I mean, you can put a runner in second and third in practice and tell them there's 2 outs in an empty baseball park, but it's different when, you're at a sold-out Seger Park, or you're at Clemson, or in the regular season when you have to play, in Gainesville or in Nashville against Vanderbilt, where those are raucous environments. It can be really hard in those positions to be able to get a ball in play and be able to bring runners home. And it's hard to really replicate that in a practice. So when I asked Mark exactly how do you go about making that adjustment, here was his response.
Well, it's a matter of making sure mentally they're in the right place. They're not trying to do too much. I think in that series, at times, young athletes try to do a little bit too much because they know how big it is. They know how much attention is on them. They know everything is going to be on the highlights. And so occasionally young athletes will try to do a little bit too much. So mentally, it's the first thing you have to focus on. And then physically, it's just a matter of what is your physical approach? Are you getting too pull happy? Are you the kind of offense and the kind of hitters that can use the whole field? And when we're going really, really well, that's what we're doing. And I think over the last week or so, we may have fallen into a little bit of a trap of guys trying to pull the ball just a little bit too much. And again, that's where we need to step in and help them identify that and then work on it, because to drive in runs, you have to be able to use the whole field. Pull hitters, dead pull hitters generally are easier to pitch to in big situations, so we need to really just continue to focus on using the whole field, being dangerous from foul pole to foul pole, and when we do that, I think you'll see those left on base numbers start to go down.
So that's how they're going to try to change their approach to hitting with runners in scoring position. The last comment in the tweet thread did say Kingston hot seat. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think it's way too early to maybe establish that at all. I understand the frustration. I said it yesterday ad nauseum that, I get it. It's different maybe if you lose 2 one-run games to a top 10 LSU team or a top 10 Florida team. You're looking at this a whole lot different than losing to top 10 Clemson twice in a row on the rivalry weekend with a game rained out by 1 run in which both games were completely winnable from the start, and you had ample opportunity to drive home the game-winning runs. Totally get it. I don't think we should go about talking about firing anybody just yet. There's still so much baseball to be played, but we'll put a bow on that. They have a game today. They'll be taking on the Citadel. 6:15 pregame, 6:30 first pitch. That's going to be on WISW, our AM sister station. And then tomorrow, they're going to be playing squaring off against Davidson, the Fighting Steph Curry's 2:45 pregame, 3 o'clock first pitch here on WNKT. And then right after that will be the men's basketball game against Tennessee. That'll be a 6:30 pregame, 7 o'clock tip-off here on our station. You'll also be able to see it on ESPN as well. Trust me, we're going to get into that today a ton. I've got a lot of thoughts about this matchup. A lot of thoughts, including how good Tennessee has been since South Carolina beat them. And if you look back at Tennessee's season, that might have been their turning point, was the South Carolina game. So you know they're going to come into CLA with vengeance on the mind and a share of an SEC title. The South Carolina team has a blueprint that can beat Tennessee. They've done it once, and this time you get to play them again, and this time in front of the comfort of your own home crowd in your own home arena. What exactly is that going to do for South Carolina? What exactly is Tennessee? How good have they been since this game? We'll also have my pal from Nashville, Joe Rexroad, on. He covers the Vols for The Athletic. Keeps I-40 hot in between Nashville and Knoxville, working for them. And he's going to come on with me here in a couple segments at 3:30 to discuss this game from the Tennessee perspective and exactly what that South Carolina loss did to them and what's this matchup going to be like on Wednesday. So excited to get to catch up with Joe and ask him a few questions there and get to talk into everything else about this big game tomorrow. But I alluded to it earlier, and I want to touch on this before we get into the next segment, and that's the SEC women's superlatives were announced this morning, and, you know, not a ton of surprise. Angel Reese was the player of the year. I don't have a gripe with that at all. I think that's pretty fair. She's the leading scorer in terms of points per game and leading rebounder in terms of, you know, rebounds per game. So I get it. I have no gripe with that selection at all. Coach of the year, Dawn Staley. I think that's a duh. She's the national coach of the year, too, if you ask me. Camila Cardoso got the defensive player of the year. Duh. Makes sense. 6'7", leads the league in block shots per game. Pretty easy. Freshman of the year, Michaela Williams from LSU. Makes a ton of sense. The second or third leading scorer on the number 2 team in the conference. Totally get it. Leilani Correa of Florida did win the 6th Woman of the Year. I think Ashlyn Watkins, you can make a case that she got snubbed for 6th Woman of the Year. Mostly because of what Ashlyn does off the bench. I mean, defensively, I think she is one of the 3 best players in the entire SEC. But Correa, you can also make the argument that for Florida, she is their 2nd leading scorer and has started less than 9 games this season. Florida didn't set the world on fire there. I mean, they're 11th in the conference, but they might not even be 11th if it wasn't for her coming off the bench and being able to give the amount of scoring that she has for them. So, like, I'll accept the argument. My vote probably would have gone to Ashlyn instead, at risk of sounding like a homer. But I think you can make the example, or at least make the argument, that Correa was the 6th Woman of the Year in the SEC. And the Gamecocks only got one All-SEC first-teamer, and that was Camilla. A little bit of a head-scratcher there, considering Tahina Paopao does lead the entire country in three-point percentage. But all second team, they did get 3 with Ashlyn, Tahina Paopao, and Raven Johnson. Malaysia appeared on the all-freshman team. Camilla appeared on the all-defensive team. But my only big gripe is the omission of Ashlyn Watkins. Real quick, from the all-defensive team, I get there. You can make a case for a lot of these girls. I know Jordan Cambridge from Vanderbilt led the conference in steals per game. That's a big deal. Mama Dembele from Missouri had a really good defensive season. I'm not knocking Madison Scott either, who was on plenty of leaderboards. But when you look at Ashlyn Watkins' season, I mean, she was snubbed because, look, she's 2nd in blocks per game, 3rd in defensive win shares, slightly above Angel Reese, 1st in defensive box plus minus in the entire conference, which is an advanced stat that basically takes into account your team's success with you on and off it and the statistical contributions that you make per 100 possessions. It's a very thorough stat. It's an advanced metric, but it's one that I trust to help evaluate defensive impact, and Ashlyn Watkins led the entire league by a lot, with Camilla coming in 2nd. She's also 1st in defensive box plus minus, another one of those, or not box plus minus, and defensive rating. And by a long shot, too. Defensive rating is just the amount of points that your team gives up per 100 possessions that you're on the floor. And South Carolina only gave up 65 points per 100 possessions with Ashlyn Watkins on the floor. That's 10 points better than Angel Reese. Angel Reese, really good defender, very well deserving of player of the year, but Ashlyn Watkins was the better defensive player. I think Ashlyn should have been on that list right there. But coming up is the game against Tennessee tomorrow night at CLA, the biggest men's basketball game in that arena's history. I did a little bit of a deep dive to try to find out the answer to that question, and we'll discuss as the postgame show continues. You can hear us on 107.5 The Game. You can also watch us on The Game TV, sponsored by Shepherd's Glass. And you can also stream us on the Game app as well. Many reasons to watch us on the Game TV. And for one, I decided to break out my, I don't wear a lot of jerseys often, but sometimes it's necessary. And today I felt the need to break out my Artis Gilmore Jacksonville University jersey. It is a deep cut, but Artis Gilmore is the one basketball player, if I could go back in time, to watch play. I would watch play. I'd probably watch Artis Gilmore play, whether it be in the ABA or for Jacksonville University. The man, when they the first year they kept blocks as a stat, averaged over 10 a game for Jacksonville and took the Jacksonville University Dolphins to a national championship where, like many other teams in college basketball those days, lost to UCLA in the national title game. So, yeah, today, rocking the Artis Gilmore jersey. And last night, Jacksonville University did beat Kennesaw State in the first conference tournament game of the season. So, happy March, everybody. Jacksonville beat Kennesaw State and ended their season. So, they moved on. So, I figured, you know what? I might as well wear the Artis Gilmore jersey today. And since we video stream these things now, too, I get to show it off a little bit. But it's one of the favorites in my very small jersey collection. Asked the question before the game, before the segment, is tomorrow night's game the biggest men's basketball game at Colonial Life Arena? I understand that the NCAA tournament did host some first and second round games there a few years ago. Most infamously, the Duke Central Florida game, where Central Florida had a look at the buzzer, where they basically had about a foot shot away that rimmed out and saved Zion Williamson and that Duke team's season. So that was that I'm going to exclude from the convo. So basically, is this the biggest Gamecock men's basketball game in the history of that arena? Now, since I am new to the market, I have been, I have been trying to study as much as I can about the history of this Gamecock program, the big games that have been played here. And I was going through today to try to see if I can find a comparable, right? So I'm going to accept other suggestions as well. So feel free to call in, tweet at us, 803-404-6100, to get in on the discussion. Tweet us at 1075 The Game on Twitter, or you can tag me at E_Campbell3, as well as text the Firehouse Subs text line, 803-404-6100. But I went back and looked, and I have a couple games that I see that can be comparable, or that look like they can be comparable. And I'll start with February 11th, 2004. Number 6 Mississippi State came in here to CLA, ranked 19-1 at the time, coached by Rick Stansbury, who is now coaching at Memphis as one of Penny Hardaway's assistants after a somewhat brief stint as the head coach at Western Kentucky. Never took the Hilltoppers to the NCAA tournament, but definitely had his reputation for potential shady recruitment follow him to Bowling Green, Kentucky. But he's now at Memphis, but was coaching the 2004 Mississippi State Bulldogs, who went on to win the SEC regular season title at like 14-2 in league play. He had some really good teams in Starkville. They went on to win that SEC regular season title. That Gamecock team did go on to the NCAA tournament as a 10 seed, and ironically lost big to Memphis. But at the time of that game, the Gamecocks were ranked 25th. Mississippi State was ranked 6th. It was still earlier in the conference slate than this game tomorrow is going to be, almost a month earlier. But at the time, South Carolina was 6-3 and in conference play. And Mississippi State was 19-1 overall, and I believe didn't have a conference loss at the time. So that's a pretty big game. National spotlight, SEC implications, some big SEC implications, a good South Carolina team, one of the handful of NCAA tournament teams that they've had since the turn of the century. Ultimately, they ended up losing that game in overtime, 79-75 in OT, and then the Gamecocks finished tied for the East regular season title, back when the SEC still did divisions. So if you want memories of a long-lost generation, it does feel like forever ago when the SEC basketball season gave out division titles between the SEC East and SEC West, but they were tied that season. Or not, just kidding, it wasn't that season. I'm sorry. 2009 was they tied for the regular season title to Tennessee, because that's where I was going next. March 5th, 2009, they played Tennessee. Tennessee was the team they tied with for the SEC East regular season title. Again, long time ago, seemingly. But that game, Tennessee won 86-70, and that ultimately ended up being the deciding factor in it being an outright South Carolina SEC East title or a shared SEC East title with the Vols. That was March 5th, so that was, I'm not going to do math to say, but that was on this day in 2009. So that's a pretty big game. I think I would still put Mississippi State in 04 as a bigger game than that one. And then the only other comparable that I could find was number 22 Kentucky coming here February 13th in the year that South Carolina missed out on the NCAA tournament despite winning like 23 or 24 games in the regular season. They were 21-3 at the time of February 13th, 2016, and fell to Kentucky 89-62. So that was a tough one. Ultimately became the beginning of the end of their season. Stumbled a little bit down the stretch, missed out on the NCAA tournament. But with all those three games that I mentioned, I still think this one's probably bigger. You have a chance to be in sole possession of first place with a game to go in the regular season. You are, like the SEC regular season title is definitely in picture, and you're playing your biggest competition for it tomorrow night at a I assume it's going to be a sold-out arena. I'd be stunned if it's not. Prime time against a team that is top 5 in the country, against a potential number 1 seed. The more and more that Tennessee's been winning, the more the discussion of them, Arizona, North Carolina, kind of jockeying for that 4th overall number 1 seed in the NCAA tournament. The opponent's better, I think, probably than those other 3 that came in here and the games I alluded to. The stakes are a little higher than those 3 games that I alluded to, and it's later in the season than all of those, the games that I alluded to. So I think you can make a case that tomorrow is the biggest Gamecock men's basketball game in the history of Colonial Life Arena. So I'm saying that now until I can be convinced otherwise. I think I'm going to stick with that take right there. So that's how big a deal it is tomorrow. Again, 7 o'clock tip-off, 6:30 pregame. Can hear that on 107.5 The Gamer and the Gamecock Sports Network. And if you want to watch it, it will be on ESPN2. So nationally televised game, and Tennessee with a win gets a share of the regular season title. And a win for the Gamecocks would put them in sole possession of first place in the SEC. Until, I guess, barring what happens with Alabama and Florida tonight. That's a big one, too. I'll get into why that game is really important later on in the show. But coming up next, I'm going to phone a friend. My man Joe Rexrode, who works for The Athletic, covers the Tennessee Vols for them, will join me in the next segment to help preview this monster matchup, discuss exactly how Tennessee's played since that big loss at Thompson Bowling Arena, and how big of a chance this Gamecock team has to be able to win an SEC regular season title after being predicted to finish dead last in the SEC coming into the season. Joe will join us on the other side. You're listening to the Postgame Show. Tomorrow night, what I have dubbed as potentially the biggest game in the history, biggest men's basketball game in the history of Colonial Life Arena, Tennessee and South Carolina. The fate of the SEC regular season potentially on the line. And joining me right now from The Athletic, covers the Tennessee Vols for them, Joe Rexrode, also on 102.5 The Game in Nashville, my former station. Joe, appreciate you joining me, and glad to have you on to be able to talk some hoops for a little bit.
Yes, man. I'm excited. Thanks for having me, buddy.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's I was talking the last segment that going through maybe some of the biggest games, since Colonial Life Arena was built, has there been a bigger non-NCAA tournament basketball game, men's basketball game played in this arena, and I don't think I could find one. So, I mean, this is a massive deal here in Columbia, and a lot of that is because this team at the beginning of the year wasn't expected to be able to be where they're at right now. Obviously, they were picked last in the SEC on SEC Media Days, and Joe, you obviously covering Tennessee, you consume a lot of SEC basketball. We watch the Gamecocks here every single night, so we can nitpick pretty extensively about this team. But as an observer of this team from the Tennessee perspective, what have you seen from the Gamecocks this year that's been so surprising?
Well, I really like the team a lot. I mean, that's the main thing. I've been super impressed. I think Lamont Paris. Rick Barnes said the other day. I mean, Lamont Paris should be national coach of the year. Forget SEC, national coach of the year. I mean, look, I thought the Florida game the other day, and I like Florida a lot. And Florida had South Carolina on the ropes, and not long ago they had Alabama on the ropes on the road too. But I thought that it seemed to me that it was almost like Lamont Paris kind of saved that 1-3-1 for when he really needed it, and then my goodness, did that flip the game. I mean, Florida's turning over left and right all of a sudden. And South Carolina comes back. But, Michi Johnson is just such a tough winner of a point guard. Obviously, Mac, I think Colin Murray-Boyles is going to be a special player. So, I like the personnel. Obviously, a huge surprise. It is easier, I think, in college basketball now to have these surprise teams because the rosters turn over so much year to year. But I'm just really impressed. And you and I were talking, during the, before I came on here about the Wisconsin flavor, of course. Lamont Paris with some great Bo Ryan teams. But I don't think Bo Ryan ever. I don't remember any 1-3-1 from Bo Ryan. That was a John Beilein, Bill Carmody kind of thing. But I don't know. I just thought that was really excellent, and I think it's been effective. And obviously, these guys did such a great job against the Vols when they came to Knoxville a few weeks ago. Yeah,
and that's the thing I was going to get to as well, because I think for a lot of people, obviously beating Kentucky at home made a lot of national headlines because Kentucky was top 10 at the time, and then Kentucky kind of went, without a pulse defensively for a while, and you can still say they don't have much of one on that end of the floor, but Tennessee's the most complete team South Carolina has beaten this year, and I think the biggest splash that the Gamecocks made nationally was that 63-59 win at Thompson-Boling Arena on January 30th. What have you seen from the Tennessee Vols since that loss?
Well, that was definitely – that game was a little bit of a kick in the butt for Jonas Adu, who's been tremendous this year, but he was not good in that game. I think you credit South Carolina's bigs, too. It's not just that he didn't play well. But that certainly that directly preceded their game at Kentucky, and they went out and, like you said, Kentucky is defense optional with those guys. But still, it was a good performance and a big win, and you got Tennessee going in the right direction. But I think what South Carolina did, Tennessee, for as much as Dalton Connect has sort of erased those killer droughts that we've seen from Rick Barnes' teams, in his tenure in Knoxville. Dalton Connect has done a lot to be the guy who ends those earlier before they become fatal. You still saw, in that night, a tremendous defensive effort and a lot of struggling from Tennessee offensively, other than Connect. Connect goes off and almost leads them back, kind of like he did lead them back against Auburn last week at 39. He has 31, but everyone else. Let's see. Connect was 11 for 24. The rest of the teams, 10 for 34 in that game shooting, and 5 for 21 from three. just really just excellent defense and toughness and physicality. And those are very much, Wisconsin and the SEC traits.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Connect does get a lot of the headlines, and he's kind of vaulted himself into a National Player of the Year conversation. I still think Edey is going to get it, but, you can't have the conversation without mentioning Dalton Connect. But one of the big differences, I guess, from the South Carolina game to now with his Tennessee team is Zakai Ziegler finally being 100%, and he's played really well since that game. I think he's averaging about 15 points and almost 8 assists since that loss. What does this team look like now that Ziegler finally feels to be about 100% after recovering from that injury?
Yeah, there's no doubt that he's different. And I think he was, around that time still even taking a step from right at the beginning of the season, which I was stunned how much he played right away. But, yeah, like in that South Carolina game, he's 0 for 6, 0 for 4 from 3. 3 assists, 2 turnovers. And you're right, Elijah, he's played great. That's the big three for them really is Connect, Adu, and Ziegler. And Adu and Ziegler were bad in that game. But Ziegler, he's just he can get wherever he wants to get. Now, he obviously still often will get into the lane and then dribble back out of the lane because he'll get his shot blocked otherwise, right? Mm-hmm. But in the meantime, he's probing, and he's often making, really nice passes, getting teammates really good shots. He's an absolute pest defensively. He's back to that, back to everything he was and then some before the ACL. So, and, the shooting comes and goes a bit. The other night I think he'd be like 4 for 14 from 3. I don't have it in front of me, but, he didn't have a great shooting night, but he hit a couple big shots. He's never afraid to take the big shot. So he's tremendous. He's mostly in control. He didn't have a great first half against Auburn last week. There's still times when I think he gets a little bit outside himself, sometimes gets into, like Ziegler and Michi, that's a great matchup. And so sometimes you get in those matchup situations and you get a little bit too into them. That happens to him sometimes, but overall, heck of a player.
And then a name that some people here in South Carolina will be familiar with because of his days playing high school ball in Charleston, Josiah Jordan James, who has been playing college basketball for a long time, the Perry Ellis of the SEC, if you will. But he's played a pretty big role in this team, too, and he does a lot of the dirty work. Him and Jemiah Mashak, I feel like, do a ton of the non-box scorable things for this team, and I think they can be a huge X factor for this group.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and Josiah, like you said, he's been around for his 5th year, and he's played all 5. Took the COVID year. I remember still writing the story for The Athletic when he was coming in. Is he one and done, or will he play one more year after this? Maybe. It's funny how you just don't know. He's had a ton of injuries, but he's he and I agree. He and Jemiah Mashak are the defensive chess pieces. Really, both of them. People say 1 through 5, and it's a little bit of exaggeration. With James, I think in particular, he really can if you need to. He played the 5 a lot the other night because Adu and Tobe Awaka both got 2 fouls early, and he can guard the whole floor. He makes the right play, and he can hit big shots. And he hit probably the biggest shot of that game, a corner 3, which came about because Alabama had to rotate because they doubled Connect on the other side of the floor. So he's a key guy, but I think of James and Vescovy kind of the same way too. Vescovy is going to make the gritty plays. He can hit shots, and those guys are, it's a balance because Connect has taken so many of the shots and so much of the offensive emphasis. They used to run everything for Vescovy, if you remember. It wasn't long ago that he needed to be the guy who got shots. So they're unselfish, and that's great. I still think this team is better. And you look at when they've lost, it's off. Usually those guys both have bad games. I still think it's good for them to try to get both of them some shots and keep them involved to some extent offensively. And I think it really balances things out when they do.
Yeah, it's funny. You go back and look at it. Vescovy in 2022 shot 253 threes and then shot 246 the next year, and this year is at 115. I don't think he's catching those shooting totals from last season unless he really, really tries for it. Joe Rexrode from The Athletic. Joe, appreciate you a ton for coming on and looking forward to hanging out with you next week in Nashville for the SEC men's basketball tournament.
Yeah, buddy. Thanks for having me. It should be awesome tomorrow, and, yeah, next week's going to be fantastic too.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And real quick before you go, I guess if I give you Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, or the field, Who are you taking?
Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, or the field in Nashville?
Yeah.
Because I can have all three over the field.
Yes. Yeah, all three of the field.
I'll take those three. I'll take those three.
Okay. Interesting.
But it's close. It's close because I can make a case for South Carolina, for Auburn.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, shoot, man. I love Mississippi State, too. I mean, I'll take – if I get all three of them, I'll take those three.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, that'll probably be the most fun and contested, I feel like, conference tournament outside of the Big 12. So looking forward to seeing you there, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks. Sounds good. Thanks, buddy. See you later.
Yeah, Joe Rexrod from The Athletic. Coming up next, I'll go put a bow on this matchup. Some final thoughts before going into the next hour, where the South Carolina women's basketball team not only had some superlatives, some awards announced for them as we go into the women's tournament, but they also received some pretty big personnel news. We'll get into all that and more as the postgame show rolls on. Coming up tonight at 6 o'clock, Carolina Calls with Coach Paris and our man Derek Scott. Derek will also be joining me here in the next hour at 4:30 to talk about tomorrow night's game. So tune into that. You'll probably hear an update about Miles Stude's injury, which it can play a big factor. Miles, fantastic three-point shooter, and for those who don't remember, he did hit the 2 big free throws at the end of the Tennessee game, with the win they had back on January 30th, where he did what might be my favorite part of the year, of not only hushing the crowd, but talking smack to the players on the free throw line too, before he even shot the ball. That is next level confidence. I think that it is admirably next level confidence that I don't know if I could achieve. To be quite frankly honest with you, that was a pretty big high point of the season. That was a lot of fun, and that was a big upset then, and it wouldn't be as big of an upset now if South Carolina were to beat Tennessee. And if you go back and look, I was looking earlier today at this matchup and looking at exactly what the both teams have done since then, and South Carolina stayed playing really good defense. They're still one of the better, I guess, more reliable defensive teams in the country. And looking back on it, Tennessee has they've been similar on defense, but they've gotten a lot better on the offensive side of the ball. And now they've kind of cracked the top 20 in KenPom. But since that game, Tennessee has the number 16 offense in the country, the number 9 defense. And defensively is what won them that game at Alabama. They have one of the more impressive wins. They're the only team this year to be able to go in to Coleman Coliseum and get a win. And that's why they are in first place right now. And that's why this team is so difficult to beat. I think South Carolina did an incredible job of making Tennessee do uncharacteristic stuff, especially when you look at the stat sheet. I mean, that was Tennessee's second worst game in terms of offensive efficiency this season, their third worst effective field goal shooting game, sixth worst two-point shooting game, their absolute worst three-point shooting game at 23%. So South Carolina's defense played arguably one of their best games of the year and forced Tennessee to play poorly. You can make the case, maybe if Tennessee makes a couple of those bunnies later on in the game, that it's a little different, but it wasn't a fluke defensively from South Carolina. And I think that's the first time this year that America, the country as a whole outside of Gamecock Nation, got a glimpse as exactly how the South Carolina team can disrupt people, because not a lot of teams are going into TBA and holding that Vols team to 59 points. They're going to be, I would say Tennessee will, more aggressive when they come here to CLA tomorrow. They're a little different in terms of like what Joe and I mentioned in the last segment, which you'll be able to hear on our podcast page at 1075thegame.com or on the Game app, or going back to watch on YouTube on the Game TV, because we'll have a replay of the entire show as well. But mentions Zakai Ziegler, and I think that might be the ultimate X factor in this game, because since January 30th, after the Gamecocks pulled off the upset in Knoxville, Ziegler's scoring about 15 points a game, averaging 7.7 assists, and he is 41% from three. 41% from three, despite going 4 of 14 in that game at Alabama on Saturday. He is finally, I would say, 100%, because he tore his ACL in early March last year. This time last year against Arkansas, he tore his ACL in one of the last home games of their season, and it took him a little bit of time to be able to come back. He's a better player now, and Joe mentioned the matchup with Michi. I think that's going to be fascinating, because I think that's where they're going to stick Ziegler. I don't know exactly where Michi will be defensively, if Michi's going to get the Ziegler assignment, and I'm going to ask Derek when we talk at 4:30, because that's going to be one of the biggest things of the game too. While Ziegler, at 5'9", isn't very physically imposing, he's great at anticipating passes. He's great at picking pockets from ball handlers. And I could see him getting the Michi Johnson assignment, considering how great Michi's been in the last 2 games, and considering Michi's definitely on fire from downtown and is starting to regain, I don't think he ever lost confidence, but regain his mojo from 3 in terms of just seeing the ball go in. I think that's going to be one of the biggest things to watch, who wins that Michi Johnson versus Zakai Ziegler one-on-one matchup. That's one to watch. And then Jemai Meshack and Josiah Jordan-James are 2 defensive stoppers. They're not much offensively. Jordan James can play undersized as a small ball 4 or 5, but is a really good rebounder. I don't know. I still think I give the edge to Tennessee, and if I'm cranking out an EBPI prediction, I think I have Tennessee at 65%, just because Connect is playing so well right now. But South Carolina, it's not going to be an easy game, and I think this is going to be 1 or 2 possessions throughout the entirety of it. And this is going to be another example as to why South Carolina is a lock for the NCAA tournament right now. And later on in the show, I'll give you some of the projections because Joe Lenardi has the most interesting projection so far for this Gamecock team of who they're going to play in the first round. Excited to get into that. But 1 hour down, 2 more to go. Got to talk about a big announcement for the Gamecocks women's basketball team announced last night. And no, it does not involve who won SEC Defensive Player of the Year or who was on the All-SEC teams. I'll tell you what that is as the postgame show continues. And, of course, you can watch all of our content on the Game TV on our YouTube page. Just search the Game TV. Go ahead, hit subscribe, and be able to have video access to all of our programming, starting with the early game with Bill, Preston, and Jen. And then, of course, the Gamecock Central Takeover Hour and the Extra Point with Tyler Head and the Gamecock Central crew. And then after that, the halftime show with Terry Ford and Tyler Head. And then, of course, get to watch me and Jay banter back and forth for 3 hours on the post-game show. You can watch all of that on our YouTube page. And, of course, everything is presented by Shepherd's Glass. Shepherd's Glass doing a great job being a title sponsor for our streaming here. And be able to watch there. Watch all the replays. I like to do some post-game video after basketball games for some instant reaction, and then a whole lot more video content that we're going to be having out soon as well on our YouTube page at The Game TV. Hour number 2 of the postgame show. I'm Elijah Campbell, taking you up until 6 o'clock today, right here on the Game, streaming live in the Game app as well as the Game TV. But a big announcement last night, a huge announcement. Obviously, the Gamecock women's team, Don Staley's bunch, wrapped up another undefeated regular season for the second straight season, going back-to-back with undefeated regular seasons, going into the conference tournament. And there was a player who put out a tweet last night that might have made the biggest news for this Gamecock women's basketball team this week. Yes, it's big news that Don Staley was named SEC Coach of the Year. Yes, it's big news that Camila Cardoso was named the SEC Defensive Player of the Year. Yes, it's really cool that they got 1 all-first team and 3 all-SEC second-team players. It's cool to have Malaysia Fulwiley be recognized as a member of the all-SEC freshman team. But Tahina Paopao tweeted out a video last night, and, I can explain what it was, but I'll go ahead and let the video speak.
What did Coach Staley talk to you about just, before making it official?
Just being a leader and being the player that she knows that I can be. Just come in a mindset that he's got to compete for everything.
I have to take this call, Chan.
Hey, Coach. It's me and my dad.
Hey, Pop.
Hey, Coach.
What's going on, Mr. Paopao?
I've been thinking a lot about what you and South Carolina have meant to T and our whole family. Last summer, you promised us that T would have another family in South Carolina looking out for her. In your program, she found a place she could flourish, be happy, and revive her love for the game of basketball. You promised T that you could get her ready for the next level in a program like South Carolina. The past 6 months have been everything we thought they could be for our whole family. They have given T life, and we are so thankful for that. But Coach, real talk. What we really called to tell you is that these last 6 months have not been enough. T wants more. So as we say in the neighborhood, from Philly to Osine, back to South Carolina.
Paopao steps back and knocks down another one.
Paopao
On fire.
quiets the crowd. Tahina Paopao shoots it better than anyone in the nation.
Hey, Coach, let's run it back.
That was how Tahina Paopao yesterday announced that she will be returning for one last season at South Carolina. She had 1 more year of eligibility as a college basketball player. Of course, she transferred from Oregon, and she had a chance to, or an option rather, to go to the WNBA draft, or announce that she would return for one final season, because she did play in the COVID year, the 2020-2021 year. So she has an option to come back for one last season, and she announced yesterday that she is going to do that. So electing not to put her name in the WNBA draft, and instead will return to Columbia for one more season. And Don Staley on Twitter responds with, "A birdie is staying in the nest. Let's go, pow." At Gamecock WBB fams, we are running it back. And that's a huge deal, man. That is a huge deal. Because when you look at the roster for next year, obviously this team just reloads anyway. Joyce Edwards is coming in. She's the number 1 player in the country. So this team reloads once again. However, you're going to be returning 4 of 5 starters. You're going to be losing Camilla. You'll lose Sakima, but Sakima hadn't started this season and has been playing in a reserve role. But to be able to have a player like Tahina Paopao, who is shooting just a mind-numbing 48.6% from 3 this year, which is her career high, and almost close to her career high in attempts per game. She's shooting about 5 3-point attempts per game and making almost 50% of them. As someone who is a 2-time All-Pac-12 player and now has come to the SEC and is an All-SEC player, second-team All-SEC, to have her come back this season is massive. And she might be, even on this team, I would say, one of the most important players on the team. Camilla, you can argue, is one of the best. Tahina's one of the best. That's how many good players are on this team. But in terms of coming back next season, this is going to make a huge impact to have 4 or 5 players come back on a team that went 29-0 in the regular season. And no matter what happens in the SEC and NCAA tournament, obviously you hope they can seal the deal and run the table and go undefeated and win the whole thing. If they do or if they don't, having her back makes you the automatic favorite to win it all next season and makes what's already going to be a loaded roster even more loaded because you return somebody who is going to be the best three-point shooter in the game again for another year in terms of percentage. Like Caitlin Clark obviously gets a lot of the love because she shoots a lot of threes and makes a high percentage of them, but she's about a 38, 39% three-point shooter, and Tina Paopao shooting at almost 50% from three. She's incredibly efficient, and she'll be one of the best players in the sport when she comes back next year for this South Carolina team. So a really cool thing yesterday to have that pop up. I believe that was tweeted at 7:22 yesterday. So a nice way to break that news, and that just tells you everything you need to know about Dawn Staley and this program and the trajectory that they're going right now. So you get arguably the most important player on your team this year to come back and be able to run it back with this program next season in pursuit of another national title. She does it all, man. So you have your best three-point shooter returning it on, and one of your best distributors, too. She's almost at 4 assists per game this season. And if you want to talk about most irreplaceable player on this team, you can make a really good argument that it is Te-Hina Paopao. So you're getting news that she's coming back next season. Fantastic news for Dawn Staley and her bunch. I was talking in the last segment, too, talking about this men's team and bracketology. I know I mentioned a little bit of it with Joe, talking about the NCAA tournament and the SEC tournament, that if you go and give him the top three in Alabama, or give him Alabama, Kentucky, and Tennessee, or the field, that he still takes those three. But you have about 6 or 7 locks in the NCAA tournament, and South Carolina is one of those locks. And as I do each day, and as I can imagine a lot of Gamecock fans here in South Carolina and outside South Carolina do every day for the last few months, I've been feverishly refreshing Joe Lunardi's bracketology page to see exactly where he's projecting the Gamecocks to be. And today I think we had the most interesting result as to where they're going to end up. In terms of all of his projections this year, he's had them consistently between seeds 6 and 10 throughout most of the year. He now has them as a 6 seed playing one of the play-in games, or playing the winner of one of the play-in games. And normally this doesn't make news, or this isn't something that I would even carve out time to talk about in detail. But the fact this hypothetical exists, I had to at least address it. Because he's got South Carolina as a 6 seed in Pittsburgh, playing the winner of Seton Hall and Virginia. Now, if they played Seton Hall, coached by Shaheen Holloway, that'd be a fun game. And I think it'd be a competitive game. I still think South Carolina would crush Seton Hall because I'm not that high on them offensively. But the real doomsday college basketball scenario is that if we get South Carolina and Virginia on the floor at the same time, that could be a little, I don't want to say problematic because they're good teams. Obviously, bad teams don't make the NCAA tournament. But for those who like high-scoring basketball, this would not be your game. Virginia is dead last in pace in the country. South Carolina plays at one of the slowest tempos in all of college basketball, and they rank 354th, so that is the 8th slowest tempo in the sport. Virginia plays dead last, the slowest. They barely average about 60 possessions a game. And that's a Tony Bennett staple, obviously. It's a pack line defense staple, is to be able to play that type of style and hold teams to 40 points or 50 points. But also at the same time, if your offense isn't very good and you play very few possessions, you're not going to score a lot of points either. And I think Virginia's got to be the only team in a projected bracket field that has, I counted 6 games this year of scoring less than 50 points. Defensively, they're top 10 in the country. And I think if those two teams played, I think defensively they would play South Carolina well. I don't think South Carolina's scoring 80 plus on them if they were to play. But Virginia this year, 6 games, finishing less than 50 points, and 4 of those games have been since February 17th. So in the past month, they have 4 games where they have scored less than 50 points, and one of those games actually was a 49-47 win over Wake Forest. They actually won one of those games in which they scored in the 40s. And I don't know if we actually had these two teams in an NCAA tournament setting, if we got them on the floor at the same time, that Las Vegas could even project a number low enough to make the over-under. That one might be first team to 45 wins And, I do believe the NCAA tournament, men and women, I think they field the bracket about as evenly as they can. I do think they're in the back of their mind, there are matchups that they maybe put in there to try to see. I think, I go back to the 2013-14 season where Kentucky was an 8 seed despite, having a decent season in the SEC, underachieving, but still playing their best ball at the right time and having a loaded roster filled with McDonald's All-Americans. I do believe there might have been a reason to put them as the 8 seed right next to 1 seed Wichita State, who was undefeated at the time. I believe that was a matchup they thought people wanted to see, and that matchup rated really, really well when they actually got to play in the NCAA tournament. But if they're fielding it like Joe Lunardi's fielding it right now, I don't think the NCAA or Turner Sports or whoever is in charge of maybe handpicking some of these matchups wants to make the opportunity available for Virginia and South Carolina to play in an NCAA tournament game, because that might be a 49-40 South Carolina win just by the tempo that these teams play. They love slowing it down. I don't think they would have that one. So I was looking through Joe Lunardi's bracketology today, and that was the latest, and I thought that was pretty interesting. But we'll get into this more as the postgame show continues, because I was thinking about this as well. South Carolina right now has 3 quad 1 wins. They have 2 quad 1 opportunities ahead, and then there's a couple of teams that are hanging out the top 30 in net that could help them out a ton. Is that going to push them into top 3 seed status? Do they have a chance to get into the top 3 seeds? Again, I've been saying that after monitoring Jerry Palm and Joe Lunardi's projections all season long, they've got the Gamecocks no higher than 5th all season long. The highest either of them have had the Gamecocks were 5th, and that's Jerry Palm, who has them as a 5th seed right now playing against South Florida, which wouldn't be a matchup that I would love by any means. But I think there's a legit shot that not only, obviously, you're playing with the SEC title implications in mind, but there's a pathway for them to be a top 3 seed in the NCAA tournament. I'll discuss how that is and what these next couple of games mean, not just with the SEC implications, but how the bracketology is working behind that as the post-game show continues. Are you interested in winning money? Yes, of course you are, because who isn't? Well, we're giving you a chance to win some money if you go to 1075thegame.com and register for the Palmetto Citizens Federal Credit Union Grand Slam giveaway. Here's how this is going to go. Every game that the Gamecock baseball team plays, $25 will be added to the pot. If a Gamecocks hitter rips a Grand Slam homer, you can win cash from Palmetto Citizens Federal Credit Union. As of now, the pot is currently at $275. For those who remember the Lawyer Lisa Special Teams giveaway contest, this is kind of like that, but with Grand Slam home runs instead of Special Teams TDs. So remember, in order to be able to be eligible, go to 1075thegame.com and register for the Palmetto Citizens Federal Credit Union Grand Slam giveaway. Coming up after I'm on air, we'll have Carolina Calls. Coach Lamont Paris and Derek Scott will be live from Liberty Tap Room, Bar and Grill. That show is brought to you by Columbia Craft. We'll also have Derek Scott on here in the next segment to help preview this big game against Tennessee and discuss the awesome win against Florida. Big week for South Carolina because there's the obvious SEC basketball implications in terms of the regular season and seeding for the tournament. I think you're in really good position to be in the top 4. That win against Florida made a huge difference, and we'll get into that part of the equation a little more in the drive around the SEC because there's a lot of big games tonight, too. Florida and Alabama is a big one for a multitude of reasons, and not just SEC, but the bracketology part of it as well. I mentioned in the last segment that the latest ESPN bracketology with Joe Lunardi has the Gamecocks as a 6. Jerry Palm's latest, which he refreshes his every day, which I appreciate. Hard job, hard to do that every day, but Jerry Palm is a machine. And he's got South Carolina as a 5 playing South Florida. And, of course, for those who've been filling out brackets every year, been filling one out religiously since I was about 6, 7 years old, that the most popular upsets that are picked every year and some of the most possible upsets that happen are the 12 over the 5. 11s over 6 happen pretty frequently, too, and so sometimes you can get, even as a 5 seed or a 6 seed, draw a really tough mid-major or maybe an underachieving team. The way Michigan State's playing, they're kind of sinking back into 10 seed, 11 seed territory or play-in territory. Seton Hall's a decent team. That's them in Virginia are decent but incredibly flawed, and that's who the Gamecocks are projected to play according to Joe Lunardi. So there's a possibility that not only can you get these key SEC wins in the next couple of days, but you can bolster an already really good resume. If you look at the net ranking right now, South Carolina's net ranking isn't great. It's at 47, but again, or the net rating, I guess, is not necessarily a power ranking, but a sorting tool to help sort out your best wins and losses to be able to kind of quantify a resume for the NCAA tournament. And as of right now, they only have 3 quad 1 wins, 7 quad 2 wins, and 2 quad 3 losses. But in the first 2 quadrants, South Carolina is 10-3, which looks really good on a resume. And I think that's one of the reasons why you're a lock to be in the big dance here next month is because you have won 10 of your 13 quad 1 and quad 2 games. That matters. Winning those games matters a ton. But what would look really good is if maybe some of those quad 2 games turned into quad 1s. But the best news is that is incredibly possible this week and starting tonight with Florida at 34 in net playing against Alabama. They'll be hosting Alabama, and Alabama is 7 in net. Just playing that game alone is going to help Florida's net ranking. But if you can get Florida to crack the top 30, then that win on Saturday becomes a quad 1 win. And the good news is, the way Florida's playing, I actually like Florida's chances to beat Alabama, and I think Florida does beat Alabama tonight. I feel pretty good about that one, despite Alabama being a computer darling this year and being the number 1 most efficient offense in college basketball. Florida's playing pretty darn well right now. And they gave South Carolina everything they could handle here, and Walter Clayton is out of his mind in terms of shooting lately. He hit 6 threes here at CLA on Saturday. If Florida wins, that's going to help you out a ton when it comes to bolstering that resume because they could like I said, very well crack the top 30. Depending what happens, Texas losing to Baylor didn't do as much damage as I thought it would. So Texas is just inside the top 30. I thought that might be them dropping out and Florida leapfrogging them being a possibility. Still could, but you also have Mississippi State hanging right outside the top 30. They're sitting at 32 right now, and if you go back and look at January 6th here at CLA, South Carolina beat the Bulldogs in the SEC opener, and that game is almost a quad 1 game, like I said, if Mississippi State is able to crack the top 30. They don't play tonight, but they do play tomorrow at Texas A&M. And, of course, all eyes on Gamecock Nation are going to be at the South Carolina-Tennessee game. But one to monitor is going to be that Texas A&M-Mississippi State game. I think Mississippi State is a better team than Texas A&M right now. I like Mississippi State. They're still really flawed offensively. But you know how I feel about Texas A&M. I made that point pretty clear when we were previewing that game that I just think they're a bad basketball team that rebounds really well. They're an overrated basketball team that just rebounds exceptionally well, and it has won them some games. But I still like Mississippi State's chances, despite them not being a good road team, of going into College Station and winning that game. If they win that game, there's a really good chance that that leapfrogs them into the top 30. So there's a really good chance that if you beat Tennessee on Wednesday, you can wake up on Thursday with 3 additional quad 1 wins, which could put you to 6 on the season. That's a lot of quad 1 wins for a team that would be a 5 or a 6 seed. So I teased it in the last segment coming into this, that is there a chance they can maybe get up to a 3 or a 4? As of now, Lenardi's 4 seeds are Kentucky, Alabama, Illinois, and San Diego State. And the 3s are Kansas, Creighton, Baylor, and Duke. In the land of the 3s, those Baylors and Dukes and Creightons and Kansases probably have resumes I don't think you'll be able to touch. Kansas has 7 quad 1 wins right now and only 1 Q3 loss. That one is a little lofty. Duke's sitting at 5 quad 1 wins, 6 quad 2 wins. And you're looking at some their average rank of win. Kentucky's average rank of win is about 130, which ranks really well in terms of the average team they've beaten in net ranking. 3 can be a little bit lofty of a goal. I think it would take winning out this season, beating Tennessee and Mississippi State, and at least making it to the SEC title game before you're in that consideration. But 4 is incredibly likely because if you look at the resumes of Kentucky, Alabama, Illinois, and San Diego State, you could even argue right now that South Carolina's resume is better than San Diego State's. San Diego State has a pretty good net rating, but they only have 3 quad 1 wins themselves, and they're 3-7 in that first quadrant, whereas South Carolina is 3-3. They're 5-0 in quad 2, but that puts them at 8-7 in the first 2 quadrants in the Mountain West. And I'm not here to dog the Mountain West because I actually think the Mountain West is the most underrated basketball conference in America. I think they're absolutely loaded with talent, and San Diego State making a run to the national title game last year, I think kind of makes that point a little bit. But this season, San Diego State doesn't have the same quality of wins I feel like that South Carolina does, and the numbers say that they're actually very similar in resume, and there's a really good chance that San Diego State gets one and done in the Mountain West because there are that many good teams in the Mountain West this year. New Mexico is going to be fighting for an at-large spot if they don't win that league tournament. Colorado State could possibly be seeing the same fate. They're going to be scrapping to avoid the bubble on Selection Sunday, but they're still a really good team with one of the best point guards in the country. Boise State is a lock as an at-large almost. They have a good chance to win that conference regular season title. There's a really good chance that San Diego State does not see even the semifinal of their conference tournament. They're an early bounce from their conference tournament away, and South Carolina maybe splitting these last 2 and making a run to the semis or SEC championship game away from a legit conversation about South Carolina being a 4 seed going into the NCAA tournament. Don't know if they crack that 3 line, but as of right now, I think you have a really good chance, because I still like your chances at Mississippi State. I actually like your chances at Mississippi State better than you do at home against Tennessee tomorrow night. It's going to be tough. The net ranking doesn't do them any favors, and that one's been a puzzling one this year because I get the non-conference slate wasn't very good, but being 24-5 and 12-4 and what I think is one of the 2 best conferences in the country right now has to say something. But alas, here we are with Lenardi having the Gamecocks as a 6, Jerry Palm having them as a 5 right now, and I think your ceiling for this team could potentially be a high 4 seed going into the NCAA tournament, and that is a very big deal for a program, obviously, who hasn't been since they've been to the Final Four, has only been in the tournament a handful of times, and was picked dead last going into the season in the SEC this year. So interesting stuff right there. There's a lot to play for, not just in SEC standings, but the bracketology element of this is pretty good. And if you're a Gamecock fan, I would definitely, against better judgment, cheer for Florida and Mississippi State here in these next 2 nights. Again, that Florida game against Alabama is tonight, and I believe that one is on ESPN. So you did the Gator Chomp in jest and then taunting them after beating them on Saturday. You might have to do it because they can help your resume a ton with a big W tonight in Gainesville. The voice of the Gamecocks, Derek Scott, he's had a pretty good view of this team all season long. He's been chatting with Jay and I every week this season, and leading into the final week of the regular season, we'll get Derek's thoughts on the matchup against Tennessee, potential seeding in the SEC tournament, and a whole lot more with Lamont Paris's bunch as the postgame show continues. From the WIS Traffic Studios, I'm Elijah Campbell with a few accidents to report to you that might be causing some delays on the roadways this Tuesday afternoon. We'll go ahead and start in Lexington County. An accident's recently been reported at Busby Road over at Highway 321. In Richland County, an accident on Dutch Fork Road, Highway 76 at US 176 and Broad River Road is causing some traffic delays, as well as some more in Richland County. One at Highway 1 and Augusta Road at Brickyard Road. Another accident at I-20 eastbound over at the Broad River Road exit, that's exit 65. And one at I-20 westbound over at Monticello Road near exit 68. One final one that recently popped up here is an obstruction on the roadway is causing some traffic delay on I-77 southbound after Garners Ferry Road, exit 9. Huge showdown tomorrow night between the current first-place team in the SEC, the Tennessee Volunteers, and the South Carolina Gamecocks. A rematch of an epic showdown in Knoxville on January 30th. Joining me right now to break it all down and discuss the big win that South Carolina had on Saturday against Florida, the voice of the Gamecocks, Derek Scott. Derek, appreciate you taking some time out of a busy day and joining me, and got a lot to talk about with this team because there's a whole lot going on.
Yeah, there is, man. It's crazy to think we've reached the final week of the regular season, but it's even crazier to think we've done so, and there's a SEC championship hanging in the balance.
That's right. I mean, if I'll give you a hypothetical here, Derek. We went in a time machine here, dropped you back off in early October of 2023, and I showed up and said, "Hey, man, South Carolina with 2 games to go has a chance to win the SEC regular season title. How fast are you calling the police?"
It would have been a leap, that's for sure. Just knowing how deep this league was expected to be, and absolutely has turned out to be. To see any team, I don't care who you are, whether it's the Gamecocks or anyone else, to tell someone a team that lost 21 games is going to the very next year be in the hunt for a league championship. That's a stretch, but that's exactly how it's transpired, and it's been an unbelievable story to follow, and to be there, in the midst of it for the entirety of it has been a real treat for me and for Casey, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely, and part of that journey was what happened on Saturday, and a lot of takeaways from that game. But I want to start off with Meechie Johnson, who solidified his candidacy as the SEC Player of the Week and a National Player of the Week after scoring 25 points, with 21 of those coming in the second half. And then he came up really big in that A&M game, not just scoring, but the pass on the final play. But what have you seen from him the last couple games that has really kind of brought him back in terms of his scoring numbers to the Meechie that we saw early on in the season?
Well, he's been able to attack more off the dribble, which is where he was so successful early in the season. When he coming out of non-conference and early in league play, when you looked at where the numbers had really jumped up from last year, a lot of it was 2-point shooting percentage. It wasn't the 3. The 3 was still reliable, but it was his ability to finish in the paint a lot better than he did last year. And that had really decreased significantly during the course of the conference season. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with the way people had defended him. People were really sitting on his right hand, trying to take that away, making him go left. And he did not look comfortable with what opportunities were presenting themselves as a result. And, the last couple games, I don't know if it's the way defenses have played him or if he's just found a counter to their defensive strategy, but he has been able to get loose again with the right hand and get into the paint and finish it for himself or set up opportunities for others, which is exactly what he was thriving at throughout the months of November and December and early January.
And Derek, in that game too, obviously Meechie's stat line stands out, but a big number that stands out to me is the number 82, because that's the amount of points that the Gamecocks scored, and that's the most amount of points they've scored in a win, I believe, since the Florida A&M game right before the turn of the calendar. College basketball is the ultimate, styles make fights type of sport, and this Gamecocks team has won a lot in the low 60s and mid 60s. What is a win against a team like Florida that plays as fast as they do and as big as they are to put up 82 points and be able to pull out a win like they did say about this group?
Well, it's a couple things. One, I don't think that South Carolina necessarily gave in on pace and played at Florida's pace, but yet the scoring makes it appear as if they did. And I just felt like where that really changed was, late in the game when they went to the 1-3-1, and they were able to create turnovers, and that created transition opportunities. And it led to some baskets, but as much as anything, it led to some fouls. And they had a lot of points at the free throw line. And then the reality of it is that, Florida defensively is not one of the stronger teams in the league. And so South Carolina got a lot of good looks throughout the course of the game because they do share the ball as well as they do. And so the shooting percentage was pretty solid throughout, but especially in the second half. And so the combination of those two factors allowed them to score more points than they typically do. And so, you needed to, because Florida's a very efficient offense, and their point total was higher than what South Carolina typically allows. And so you had to do it to win. And that's the thing about this team. They have been able to adjust from game to game, and whatever the formula that is required on a given day to win is, they've been able, by and large, to find, success. And it hasn't been doing it one particular way every time out. There might be a few things that are typically involved in their wins as far as holding opponents below 70 and holding opponents to 5 or fewer three-pointers. That's usually a big part of it, but it's not an exclusive thing. And they won a little bit on Saturday in I guess you would say, non-traditional fashion. And it's not the first time they've done it, but it's certainly something that was needed against the Gators.
And I want to bring up that 1-3-1 zone, too, because really it's, I think, the second time this year you could say that the deployment of that defense really changed the tone of the game. It happened against Georgia on the road at Stegman earlier this year. And I charted it in the first 9 possessions against Florida. Florida mustered out 5 points and turned the ball over 4 times, and 3 of those 5 points came on a contested 3 with less than 2 seconds on the shot clock.
Right.
So what exactly do you like from that defense? Because that was an incredible adjustment.
Well, it's interesting because they've got the pieces there to make that 1-3-1 so effective, and it starts with Zach Davis at the top of it. I think everybody could see that. Zach was an obstruction to Florida's guards. He's so long, and he basically just put up a wall in the middle of the court and made it so hard for the two guards to get the ball back and forth to each other. He had as many kicked balls as he had deflections with his hands. And so that disrupted things. That was the beginning of the problem. And you could see that in, as you mentioned, the turnovers that were created. But then the second layer to that 1-3-1 that I think is really probably not as noticeable, but is vitally important, is putting Colin Murray-Boyles in the middle of the 1-3-1. Because if people are going to beat a 1-3-1 zone, it usually starts with getting someone in the high post, get the ball to them in the high post, and then at that point you've taken the top of the defense out of play, and you then have, kind of a triangle look, and you can break guys down from there. But they could not get the ball easily into the high post because Colin's so good in terms of his length, his ability to get his hands on so many basketballs, and his quickness, his foot speed. He got out to the positions where they were getting the ball to. And those top 2 on the 1-3-1 are, man, that's a couple of dynamic pieces. And then you've got Josh at 7 feet tall. Josh Gray as the rim protector on the back end of it. So that's 3 layers to a 1-3-1 zone. And, the best zone defenses are usually, teams that are really long on the wings. In a 2-3, a matchup like Syracuse made famous. But if you're going to play 1-3-1, it's really got to be, the key is the top and the bottom of it. And then Colin gives you a really unique piece in the middle of it. So, yeah, you're right. It's 1-2 games for South Carolina in conference play. And as effective as it was on Saturday, everybody's got to spend a lot more time preparing for, whether it's Tennessee or Mississippi State or whoever we run into in the postseason. If you saw film of that game Saturday, you're going to have to now make that something you are absolutely prepared for, because the Gators were not, and it absolutely cost them the game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the Tennessee game. That's a kind of a big deal here in this town tomorrow night. I was tossing around the hypothetical in the first hour because, I haven't been in the market long, but I went back through the years and tried to find what I would consider maybe a bigger men's basketball game played since CLA was built, and I quite frankly couldn't find one. Found one that was close, dating back to 2004 when number 6 Mississippi State came to town. But where would you rank this one in terms of, I guess, importance and opponent in terms of the biggest games in that building?
Well, and I'm not going to sit here and claim to be a building historian because I didn't get here until, 2007. But certainly I can speak with confidence in my period of time in this community and around this program. And there's not anything else I could come up with that's particularly close. Not in regards to, a home game. Yeah, there have been some huge games that have been, in neutral site settings, primarily NCAA tournament and such. But as far as on this court, for men's basketball, no, I'm with you. I can't come up with a matchup for it because you've not been in the hunt for an SEC championship. The only thing I can even think that, just as I say that, pops into my head, and it didn't feel this big, but it certainly mattered, was another Carolina-Tennessee game. And I'm going to struggle to give you the exact year, but it was the first year of Darren Horn tenure. The Gamecocks ended up winning a share, if I'm not mistaken, of the division championship that year. But there was a huge game with Tennessee and Bruce Pearl at the very end of the year. Similar situation. I don't think it was the last game of the year. It may have been like this, the last home game, but it may have been the last game. But that's the only one I can think of that had that much kind of weight on it as far as what it could mean, for that program. But again, that's a South Carolina team that didn't end up even making the NCAA tournament. So in spite of what was, on the line in regards to the conference, it didn't have this kind of national juice in terms of the rankings that the teams carried into it.
Got about 30 seconds here for you, Derek, so I'll keep this question real short. South Carolina beats Tennessee if?
Oh, wow, that's a great one. I think you've got to be able to score against this Vols team. They are really, really good defensively, and I think to score against them, you've got to be able to make shots from the perimeter. So if I had to just throw out a random number, I'd say if they hit double-digit three-pointers. That would be my take on it. Is that's what's going to be required to loosen them up a little bit. You're going to need guys to be able to dial it in from downtown, and I think you're going to see Miles Studi available again, which helps that effort for sure.
Oh, definitely. That would be a big shot in the arm for this bunch. You can hear Derek tonight on Carolina Calls starting at 6 o'clock with Coach Paris. Derek, thanks for taking some time to join me, and looking forward to seeing you at the arena tomorrow night.
You got it, man. Thanks.
Derek Scott tomorrow night. Big showdown. You heard it from him, too. Maybe the biggest South Carolina home men's basketball game since CLA was built. I think I agree with that sentiment. But we'll see. Huge game, potentially with SEC title implications. And speaking of Gamecocks, there's a former Gamecock who has his name in an ESPN mock draft, and it can be good news and bad news. I'll tell you why. Coming up next.
quite different for the Tulane Green. Xavier Leggett.
Yeah, that's more like it with him, too.
4.39.
That was Xavier Leggett at the Combine, where he wowed people with his speed and his agility. And obviously an impressive final year here at South Carolina, and he will be in the NFL next year. I can guarantee that. Not great predictions, but I can guarantee you that Xavier Leggett will be playing in the National Football League next year. And according to ESPN's Jordan Reed, who I think is a fantastic talent evaluator for that four-letter network run by Mickey Mouse, he did his 2-round mock draft, and as of right now, he has Xavier Leggett going number 43 overall. That's the good news, that you're a top 2-round pick. That's fantastic news. The bad news, it's going to the Atlanta Falcons, who don't necessarily have their quarterback shaped up or planned out yet, because as of right now, Desmond Ridder, whatever veteran you think you can sign. I mean, would Kirk Cousins be available? I don't know. If he is, he's coming off an Achilles tear. He's been in the league for over a decade, so you don't know exactly how well that's going to pan out. Don't love, I guess, the amount of veteran quarterbacks available for the Falcons. And if you've been a Falcons draftee the last few years, you have experienced the incredible frustration of being projected to be part of a really good offense with other talented players, but just not getting the football. No one has wasted position players in the early rounds of the NFL draft quite like the Atlanta Falcons. Kyle Pitts, who we know here in SEC country as one of the best tight ends I think we've ever seen in the SEC in terms of being an athletic specimen and just making plays and being incredibly productive on a football field, almost single-handedly took that Florida Gator team to an SEC championship back in 2020. And for my vote, one of the best SEC tight ends I've ever seen, given that size and athletic ability. He gets drafted by the Falcons in the first round. Top 10 pick, top 5 pick, I believe, and just not used. Has a lot of time on the bench. Arthur Smith was not a fan of using Kyle Pitts. They drafted Drake London in the first round, wide receiver out of Southern Cal, who I thought that year had the best, I guess, measurables, who I thought was going to be the best NFL receiver out of that group. Hadn't really panned out because it's hard to pan out if you don't get used on offense. And then this past year, Bijan Robinson, running back out of Texas, had a good start to the year, but saw his usage decline as the season went on. And yes, I understand fantasy football is not real football, but for those who play fantasy football and have drafted any of those guys, you know that the usage of them, despite being incredible all-world talents, has been highly questionable. And maybe that's one of the reasons that Arthur Smith got canned, and he's back to doing what he does best, and that's being offensive coordinator, but this time in Pittsburgh, which I think is a good hire by Pittsburgh. I don't want to trash Arthur Smith too much, but he was not a good head coach. He's a much better offensive coordinator, which is ironic considering he didn't get those 3 talented players the ball enough. And maybe a lot of that comes from not having a quarterback to use. I guess when your options are Desmond Ridder and Taylor Heineke, you're a little limited. But Jordan Reed from ESPN has Xavier Leggett going number 43 to the Atlanta Falcons in the second round of the draft. And here's his blurb that he wrote explaining that. Washington's Michael Penix Jr. could make a lot of sense here, but I still think the Falcons will take the veteran route to find a quarterback. Despite already having a high-end playmakers all over the offense, Atlanta could land another explosive pass catcher in Leggett for whoever ends up under center. He had a great combine, and I see an NFL-ready frame at 6'1", 220, and 221 pounds, as well as strong hands on tape. He said Michael Penix Jr. is an option, and then he goes on to have the Las Vegas Raiders taking Michael Penix Jr. With that very next pick after Leggett. So it's an interesting projection there, and we're getting into mock draft season with the NFL draft being, about a month and a half away. So it's going to be really interesting to see exactly, now that we're past the combine, where Xavier Leggett's draft range is. I personally think he will be in the second round. I highly doubt he slips out of the top 2 rounds. He's way too talented. And when we had Teron Davenport from ESPN on the show a few weeks ago, he says he reminds him a lot of A.J. Brown because of what he's able to do with his route running ability, his strong hands, and how explosive he is after the catch. And I can kind of see the A.J. Brown comparison a little bit. A.J. Brown might be maybe a little more physically imposing than Xavier Leggett, but their skill sets are very similar. So it's interesting. We'll have Teron on in the next couple of weeks as well because Teron was at the Combine, and he is about as high as on Xavier Legette as about any other draft prognosticator that I follow or keep up with or know. So it's interesting. Early second round is where Jordan Reed has Xavier Legette going, and that's to the Atlanta Falcons. Did not have Spencer Rattler taken in the first 2 rounds. Spencer Rattler, I think, is going to be a very interesting one to see exactly where he lands. Final hour, postgame show coming up. From the WIS traffic studios, I'm Elijah Campbell with a few accidents to report to you that might be causing some delays on the roadways this afternoon. We'll go ahead and start off here in Richland County. An accident reported in front of Lowe's on Highway 1 near Augusta Road and Sparkleberry Lane. Traffic's moving pretty slowly there. Avoid it if you can. Here in Columbia, an accident at I-20 eastbound over at Broad River Road near exit 65 is causing some backup. One more on I-20 westbound over at Monticello Road near exit 68. An obstruction on the roadway is causing traffic to move pretty slowly on I-77 southbound. That's going to be after Garner's Ferry Road, exit 9. We also have an accident at US 176 near Broad River Road near I-26. And lastly, we have one at US 378 near I-77 over near Exchange Boulevard. So that accident's causing traffic to move pretty slowly through there. That's right. It's 5 o'clock, and you know what that means. It means it's time to give you the latest news. We'll go ahead and start local. A couple of South Carolina women's basketball news. One big one last night announced at 7:22 on the app, the Bird app, formerly known as Twitter, now known as X. Te-Hina Paopao announces that she will be returning for one more year in a Gamecock jersey. She's going to run it back. Transfer from Oregon, had one more year of eligibility if she elected to take it, because she did start her career at Oregon in the 2020-2021 season, which according to the NCAA in terms of eligibility does not exist. So she did have one more to use at her disposal. She is electing to use that and maybe increase her WNBA stock and make her a better player, prepare her for the pros, which makes total sense. Te-Hina Paopao shooting at about 48.6% from three on the season, is one of the best sharpshooters in the country, and would be the fourth of five starters to return to the team next season. Camila Cardoso more than likely will be heading to the WNBA draft. So that's some big news for the Gamecocks for next season. But for this season, the SEC has went ahead and announced ahead of their conference tournament the 2024 SEC Awards. LSU's Angel Reese takes home the Player of the Year. Coach Don Staley gets Coach of the Year. Camila Cardoso, Gamecock, wins Defensive Player of the Year. LSU's Michaela Williams was awarded Freshman of the Year. The sixth Woman of the Year ended up going to Leilani Correa of Florida, and the Scholar Athlete of the Year is Mama Dembele at Missouri. In terms of all SEC first team, only one Gamecock appeared on that list. That is Camila Cardoso. And then on the all SEC second team, the Gamecocks got three on there with Raven Johnson, the aforementioned Te-Hina Paopao, who will be returning next season, and Ashlyn Watkins, a.k.a. Ashlyn Swatkins. And then the all-freshman team, one Gamecock appears on the list, and that is Mylasia Fulwiley, the electric freshman from Keenan, who has had a fantastic season and has been a crowd dazzler at CLA all season long, coming off the bench for Don's squad. And then on the all-defensive team, only one Gamecock appears. That is Camila Cardoso, who naturally will appear on the list after being the SEC Defensive Player of the Year. In the first hour, I kind of explained why I thought Ashlyn Watkins deserved to be on that all-SEC defensive list. And if you ask who to take out, I mean, I think you could probably make a case that she ended up having a better defensive season, purely on the defensive side of the ball, than Angel Reese did, or maybe a Madison Scott from Ole Miss. But all players deserving. Just felt like Ashlyn Watkins might have gotten snubbed there a little bit. So that's some of the biggest news coming out of the Gamecocks women's program today. And the NFL, there are all types of news right now. It is franchise tag season, and the Colts, the Indianapolis Colts, placed a $21.8 million franchise tag on wide receiver Michael Pittman. Pittman was expected to be one of the many free agents this season at the wide receiver position that could have helped out a lot of teams. T. Higgins' contract is expiring out of Cincinnati. Mike Evans, we thought, might be a free agent because him and Tampa Bay didn't get a contract situated during the season. But as we said yesterday in this same very 5 o'clock news segment, Mike Evans did re-sign with the Buccaneers, 2 years, $52 million. About $35 million of that is going to be guaranteed, and a guy who is I would say Hall of Famer. I don't even want to use the word potential. I think he will be a Hall of Famer, is looking like he will end his career in Tampa. The Seahawks, a team going through a ton of change here in these last few months. They released Jamal Adams, Quandre Diggs, and tight end Will Dissly. Jamal Adams at one point in time was considered one of the best safeties in the NFL, going back to his days as a New York Jet, and then his trade to Seattle was a blockbuster deal. Adams is a three-time Pro Bowl selection, and it looked like he was about to make about non-guaranteed $16.5 million in 2024, which would count $26.9 million against the salary cap. Hard to explain because the NFL salary cap, while it is a very much so a real thing, is also part voodoo because no one knows how it truly works, and the dark art of funny money is abundant in the sport, but Seattle couldn't make that work with Jamal Adams and have everything fit underneath the cap because of that almost $27 million hit. So they elected to cut him. So that will wipe off $16.5 million off of their books, and as well as reportedly $17.5 million non-guaranteed that he was scheduled to make in 2025, which had been the last year of his contract, according to ESPN's Brady Henderson, who does a really good job of covering the Seahawks. And with them releasing Quandre Diggs, that frees up $11 million in cap space. Will Dissly's release will give them $6.97 million worth of wiggle room. That's pretty big news out of Seattle, so they're making some changes with the salary cap. But a big news in college basketball, or the college sports world. I don't want to limit it to college basketball, but the college sports world, and that is that the Dartmouth Hoops players have voted to join a local union. It was announced, here recently that they have been, they won a court case that would allow them to unionize were they to vote to do so. And Dan Murphy had the reporting on ESPN earlier today saying that the Dartmouth men's basketball team voted 13-2 Tuesday to join its local service employees union. And this marks the first time any group of college athletes has taken a public action as employees of their school, and potentially setting a precedent that could significantly alter the business of college sports. And that is very, very big. Jay and I know I've talked at length here in the last few weeks about the future of college athletics, and really this was one of the things that hung into the balance as to what's going to mold the future of college athletics. If they get considered employees, there's a lot of things that are going to have to change with the structure of college athletics. Obviously, if they have a union, there's going to be further rules in terms of compensation. There is going to be different ways in which they can be compensated after they get hurt, because if they get hurt in games, now it's workers' comp, as has been well brought up by some of our listeners and callers, that it's going to drastically change the college sports landscape. So they officially voted, and it looked like almost unanimously, 13-2 on Tuesday. So while the Dartmouth men's basketball team doesn't do much on the actual basketball floor, they made a decision to make big news earlier today and have become the first group of college athletes to join an local service employees union. That's a pretty big deal. That is a very large deal, and we'll see the ripple effects of that as the months lead on. And obviously, the NCAA is dealing with their own thing. They can't investigate Tennessee's NIL investigation. They had to pause that because of a court ruling. So the future of college sports had another domino fall today. We'll see exactly how that ends up impacting the rest of college basketball, college football, all other collegiate sports. And in speaking of things that could be controlled with a union, because for all those who play Madden or NBA 2K or any video game, the reason you can have players in those games using their name, image, and their likeness as playable characters in video games is because of their players union. And one thing people got really mad about for the new EA Sports video game is that the compensation for the players who are electing to have their name, image, and likeness in this video game will get only $600 in a copy of the game. I think that's perfectly fair, considering there is no market for this. This game hasn't been made in over a decade now. We don't have a reasonable known market of what a college athlete's name, image, and likeness is worth at various levels, because so many of these deals aren't made public and come through third parties who don't have to disclose this type of information. But if they want more money, unionizing and having a players union like the NFL and NBA does could allow them to make more money from a video game, like with what EA Sports is making. But speaking of that, Arch Manning, who's the quarterback at Texas, the backup quarterback, famously nephew of Peyton and Eli Manning, has opted out of the EA Sports video game. This is from Mark Schleybaugh on ESPN. With more than 10,000 college football players that have already opted in for EA Sports College Football 25, which will launch this summer, the fans will have to wait at least another year for Texas quarterback Arch Manning to lead their teams on the new video game. Manning, a sophomore backup for the Longhorns and the nephew of former NFL quarterbacks Peyton and Eli, is among the players who have opted out of being included in the video game, a source confirmed to ESPN on Tuesday. So, no Arch Manning in the video game, for reasons not necessarily sure why, but he's, I guess, probably the biggest name to elect not to be in it. For those who are excited about this game, like myself, I've already told Jay earlier, I think it was last week when we were talking about this video game, that I am going to be willing to spend the money that I don't like to spend for a PlayStation 5 to be able to play this game, but there will be no Arch Manning in it. There was a tweet earlier today from Anwar Richardson. He's a former Bucks, Lions, and NFL reporter at Yahoo and covers Texas football for OrangeBloods.com. It say multiple people have told me Texas redshirt quarterback Arch Manning will not opt into EA Sports College Football 25. I'm told Arch is focused on playing football on the field, which is a little odd to say personally, because I don't think anyone who takes the 5 minutes to submit to EA Sports your info, like your height, your weight, maybe a picture of you to get your physical appearance right, is taking focus away off the field. So it does feel a little odd to specify that you're focused on the field because you didn't take the 30 seconds to input information that could have gotten you $600 and a free copy of the video game. But to each their own. But he will not be in the game next season. In the baseball world, some injury news to report. Jeff Passan earlier today reports that Red Sox right-handed pitcher Lucas Giolito might miss the season. According to Passan's report, initial imaging showed damage in the right elbow of Boston Red Sox starter Lucas Giolito that could cause him to miss the 2024 season. League sources told ESPN. Giolito, who was expected to be the Red Sox opening day starter, has a partially torn ulnar collateral ligament and flexor strain that could require surgery that would likely keep him out for the entirety of 2024, according to sources. So the Red Sox projected opening day starter might have his season end before it even began. Tough news for the Red Sox as the season as opening day is vastly approaching earlier in April. We'll see exactly how that ends up paying out. Speaking of franchise tags, I know I opened up the segment talking about the franchise tag news of Michael Pittman. There are other notable names franchise tagged and not franchise tagged. New York Giants running back Saquon Barkley was not given the franchise tag by the New York Giants, which will make him a free agent. I can imagine Saquon Barkley will be one of the more highly coveted free agents in the NFL here this spring, now that we're already in early March and about to surpass the franchise tag deadline. We're going to be reaching free agency pretty soon, and it'll be interesting to see exactly what market Saquon Barkley demands. I think it's no secret that the running back market in the NFL has taken a dramatic hit. The position has been devalued at every turn. So it'll be interesting to see exactly what Saquon Barkley demands in the free agency market and what he's actually able to get, or what team is willing to pay him a lot of money for his services. But at the end of the day, it will not be in a New York Giants uniform, more than likely not, unless they agree on another contract. I don't foresee that happening, especially since the Giants elected not to franchise tag him. And last piece of franchise tag news, Michael DeRocco from ESPN, who covers the Jacksonville Jaguars for them, announced that Josh Allen, no, not that Josh Allen, another Josh Allen, linebacker for the Jacksonville Jaguars, a star linebacker from Kentucky from back in the day, is getting the franchise tag. He reports that the Jags placed the, quote, non-exclusive franchise tag on pass rusher Josh Allen on Tuesday. So using the tag fully guarantees Allen a $24 million salary in 2024 and buys the team time to work out a long-term extension with their 2019 first-round pick. Allen had a really solid season for the Jags last year, and he's one of their, what I would say, a core piece of that team, a solid piece that has helped give them their ascension from cellar dweller in the AFC to a division champ last year, and honestly was a bad month and a half away from being able to crack the playoffs this year. I think as a franchise, they're still in decent shape, and them being able to franchise tag Josh Allen guarantees that he is a Jag for at least one more season at $24 million against their salary cap. That's our 5 o'clock news, brought to you by our friends over at Integrated Media, the best in the biz. Thank them for all they do, especially when it comes to helping set up our video streaming equipment. The Game TV, brought to you by Shepherd's Glass. That is brought to us a lot, in large part, to our friends at Integrated Media. Help set this up, and whenever things start to malfunction, I can always ask Michael. Always a text away to help me out whenever it does. And coming up next, a famous South Carolina coach does not give a ringing endorsement of a current SEC coach. I'll tell you who that is as the postgame show continues. College football season doesn't kick off back again until late August. So we're still about 5 months away. But, that hasn't stopped some names that are currently holding prestigious college football coaching gigs to already be put maybe on a little bit of a hot seat. And sometimes that is because of the performance on the field. But while that seat might be hot, maybe some outside or inside voices can make that seat significantly hotter to the point of maybe scorching. Maybe they don't make the seat scorching or hotter, but their voices revealing certain things maybe bring it to light how hot the seat actually is. And when we go into the 2024 season, there might not be a coach on a hotter seat than Billy Napier at Florida. Underachieved the last few years. Well, not underachieved. The roster hadn't been good. They haven't been able to get really good rosters the last few years, and the few good players that they've been able to get oftentimes leave. Just a couple months ago, Trevor Etienne, brother Travis Etienne, who was one of the leading rushers for Florida last year, opted to get in the transfer portal and not just transfer away from Florida, not just transfer to a foe in the conference, but Etienne opted to transfer to their biggest rival in Georgia. I don't know if I've ever seen a player transfer from one of those schools to another. Maybe that has happened, and I'm not summoning the name and won't be able to conjure it up for a bit, but this is a pretty odd scenario of a player who was a key component to Florida's offense and, quite frankly, was one of the reasons they won one of their biggest games last year in the Tennessee game. But he's going to be in a Georgia Bulldog uniform next year, and naturally that is rubbing a lot of Florida fans and donors the wrong way. Well, that's already put Billy Napier's seat significantly hotter. Not quite like it was, or actually more so than it was, than his first year, barely making a bowl game and kicking a field goal despite being down 30 just so they could salvage a record of consecutive points scored. And is made even worse after going 5-7 this year, despite an exciting, thrilling win here in South Carolina that made it look like, wow, maybe Florida's, going to be able to get themselves into a bowl game and get some positive for momentum next year. That did not happen. Their season crashed and burned. They went 5-7, and Billy Napier has a losing record as the coach at Florida and has really bad records against some of their biggest rivals. They'd be winless against their biggest rivals in Florida State, Georgia, and Tennessee if a second quarter in which Etienne ran all over the place helped them in the swamp beat Josh Heupel and the Vols. But with all that, Napier's seat's hot enough. But Steve Spurrier, legendary Gamecock coach, couldn't help but make that seat publicly scorching, or at least reveal how scorching it actually is. Reading an On3 story from earlier today, it was sent to me by a good pal, Justin Hall, who does the high school postgame show here on the game during the high school football season, sent me this and was like, I don't know if you've seen this, but not good news for our boy Billy. And that's in an interview with Gene Frenette of the Florida Times-Union. Quote, the famous and most beloved Florida football alum torched Napier's program. So these are quotes that Steve Spurrier said in a newspaper interview here recently. He said, quote, Billy is a good guy who works his tail off. I like Billy. Good family man, but we do wish the organization was a little bit more tidy, said Spurrier. He goes on to say there's a feeling around the Gators of, what the heck are we doing? There's a lot of questions that I don't have the answers to about organization. Just because you hired the most people doesn't mean you're going to win. All these extra people, I question how much that really helps. Later on in that interview, Spurrier ultimately started criticizing Florida's NIL efforts, which resulted in one of the most embarrassing NIL fiascos this year with the Jaden Rashada incident, and then even alludes to the Trevor Etienne departure to Georgia. He says, how many Gators growing up would think we'd lose our best running back to Georgia? And he's right. He's right. Steve Spurrier versus almost any other college football coach is a rivalry in college sports unlike any other. He's not afraid to take shots. He's not afraid to say his opinion. But he didn't necessarily give a ringing endorsement of Billy Napier. And if we're going to go ahead and start looking at a list of coaches who are on the biggest hot seats going into 2024, I think this was quite the indictment that Billy Napier is in not just win now mode, it's must win to save your job mode. And I don't think the Gators did a good enough job of talent acquisition to be able to make Gator fans feel confident that they're going to be able to get into a bowl game this year or even go 7-5. Yes, if they go 7-5 or even 8-4 next year, it'd be an improvement, but is that still going to make Florida football fans excited? This is a program that won 2 national championships a little over a decade ago, and now they've had their second straight losing season. It's been a long time since this Florida, and I mean, I won't say a long time. I mean, 2020, they were in the SEC championship game against Alabama with Dan Mullen. Dan Mullen neglected recruiting. Dan Mullen got canned, and Billy Napier was a hot shot candidate out of Louisiana Lafayette who helped turn them around and make them one of the best programs in the Sun Belt. He was a hot coaching commodity who's been on really good staffs. He's been on Nick Saban's staff at Alabama before. He's well respected in this profession. And with what Steve alluded to, he brought a huge staff to Florida with him. There's a lot of people on that Florida Gators payroll. A whole lot of people. If you look at the team photo last year, it's comical how many more people that are in that photo don't have pads and instead have Florida Gator polos on instead. Their support staff is about as deep in terms of just raw numbers as anybody in the country. They're spending a lot of money on the staff. In 2 years, the staff has produced losing seasons. And now when Steve Spurrier, who is a guy who not only coached Florida to some of their highlights, some of the best seasons in the history of that program, he was a Heisman Trophy winning quarterback for Florida. I know we all know him here as the head ball coach for the South Carolina Gamecocks, who took him to their only SEC championship game in school history, who took them to what is the golden era of South Carolina football. But if you think about it here, if Steve Spurrier said that about Shane Beamer here, the response would be not good. We'd be talking a lot about, wow, the seat's really, really bad. If Steve Spurrier is talking to a newspaper, talking about how bad the situation has been and how embarrassing the losses are and how the departure of players to arch rivals is a huge deal. Shane doesn't have that problem here. But Billy Napier's got him a big one. And that is not having the endorsement, or his program not having the endorsement of Steve Spurrier. I will say Spurrier made a point to mention how he likes Billy Napier. He thinks Billy Napier's a hard worker. And like I said earlier, he's got a great reputation in the coaching world. But when Steve Spurrier is lashing out, is going out of his way to talk to newspapers, to talk about how he doesn't approve how the program's going, how no one has any idea what the heck is going on in Gainesville or within the doors of that program, the problems aren't exaggerated. If anything, they might be worse than we believe. We'll see how that plays out next year. Billy Napier, if you are a betting man and you're willing to put money down on the first SEC coach fired in 2024, I'm not an odds maker. But based off what we're hearing from Steve Spurrier and the results of the last 2 years, I think Billy Napier might be the guy with the best odds on that board. We'll take a drive around the SEC coming up next here on the Postgame Show. From the WIS Traffic Studio, I'm Elijah Campbell with a couple of accidents to report that are causing some delays on the roadways. We'll go ahead and start off with some long-term road construction. This is going to be on I-20 between I-26, exit 64, and the Broad River Road, exit 65. The estimated time of completion is going to be in April. So on I-20 between I-26, exit 64, and the Broad River Road, exit 65, there'll be some long-term construction for at least another month. Some accidents, one reported on US 378 near I-77. That's causing some potential delays, as well as two more in Richland County on I-20 eastbound at Broad River Road near exit 65, and one more in front of Lowe's on Highway 1 at Augusta Road in Sparkleberry Lane. It's time to take a drive around the SEC. A lot of SEC news to get to. I touched on a lot of this earlier in the show, but in case you missed it, the SEC women's basketball superlatives were announced recently. By recently, I mean this morning they finally were announced. And before that, just yesterday, we didn't get to this in the drive around the SEC segment, but Ashlyn Watkins was named the SEC Women's Basketball Player of the Week. She also found herself on the list of some hardware that she's going to be getting individually as the awards were announced in terms of Coach of the Year, Player of the Year, First Team All-SEC, Second Team All-SEC. And in terms of Gamecocks that have received recognition, Coach Dawn Staley got the Coach of the Year. Camila Cardoso won Defensive Player of the Year. Camila was also on the First Team All-Defense in the SEC. Mylasia Fulwiley earned All-Freshman honors in the conference. And then Raven Johnson, Tahina Paopao, and Ashlyn Watkins were all named Second Team All-SEC performers. Rounding out the other awards for the women this year, the 2024 SEC Women's Basketball Player of the Year is LSU's Angel Reese. LSU also got some more hardware with the Freshman of the Year that was awarded to Tiger freshman Michaela Williams. Gator six woman Leilani Correa ended up winning Sixth Woman of the Year, just narrowly beating out Ashlyn Watkins. And then Mama Dembale was the Scholar Athlete of the Year from Missouri. Now, rounding out the rest of the All-SEC first team, outside of South Carolina's Camila Cardoso, was Tennessee's Rakea Jackson. Ole Miss had two players on the All-First team with Madison Scott and Marquisha Davis. LSU has Angel Reese, obviously, as a First Team All-SEC, as she's the Player of the Year, and as well as Anissa Morrow, who was on that list. And then Auburn's got one with Honesty Scott Grayson, and Alabama's Sarah Ashley Barker rounds out the list. The second team, like I said, South Carolina's got three second-teamers on here with Raven, Tahina, and Ashlyn. The list is rounded out by Vanderbilt's Iana Moore, Mississippi State's Jarkela Jordan and Jessica Carter, LSU's Flau'jae Johnson, Georgia's Javon Nicholson, for those who don't remember, came into CLA and put up a bajillion points in that valiant effort in the loss to South Carolina. Sixth Woman of the Year, Leilani Correa, is on the All-SEC second team, as well as Aaliyah Nye from Alabama. So a lot of Gamecocks getting recognition from the SEC as we head into the SEC Women's Tournament, which will start tomorrow in Greenville, starting off with 12th-seeded Kentucky taking on 13th-seeded Georgia. That game will be at 11 a.m. on the SEC Network. I'll be in attendance for that, giving updates here throughout the day on our shows. Since Jay and I won't have an official show tomorrow, I'll be over in Greenville giving reports from the tournament and maybe projecting a little bit how the Gamecocks are going to perform, as they don't start their SEC tournament until Friday, March 8th, and they'll be taking on the winner of Mississippi State in Texas A&M. The next game tomorrow after Georgia-Kentucky concludes, about 25 minutes or so after it concludes, Florida and Missouri. 11-seeded Florida versus 14-seeded Missouri. The winner of that game will take on Vanderbilt. And the winner of the Georgia-Kentucky game will play 5-seeded Tennessee. All that will be on Thursday, March 7th. Tonight, the last Tuesday night of the regular season in the SEC, there are some monster matchups to look for just this week. But tonight, the big one is definitely going to be Alabama at Florida. Alabama sitting in second right now, right ahead of South Carolina. They have the tiebreaker. Both South Carolina and Alabama are 12-4. A win for Florida would give South Carolina a half-game advantage, and then if South Carolina were to win tomorrow night, then they would almost secure their chances of finishing above, or get close to finishing their chances of finishing above Alabama and locking in a top 4 spot. But the game tonight, Alabama at Florida, it's going to be at 7 o'clock on ESPN, so it's getting the national spotlight. That is a big game, and it's a big game for Florida as well, who is currently sitting at 10-6 in the conference, which is 6th place with 1 game behind Kentucky. And they split with Kentucky in their season series, and they're also a game behind Auburn, 2 games behind South Carolina and Alabama, and 3 games behind Tennessee. Auburn will take on Missouri tonight at 9 o'clock. That's going to be on the road. Missouri still with a goose egg in the win column. They could be the first team since 2018's Vanderbilt, or 2017-2018 Vanderbilt team that finished 0-4 in the conference. And I never thought we'd see that again. To editorialize a little bit here, I covered that team for a small newspaper in Lebanon, Tennessee in my last semester of college, and got to cover almost every SEC game they played that season. Obviously, they lost all of them. And I remember watching that team and thinking, you know what? There might not be a team this bad in this league ever again. As good as the SEC is, as good as the resources are for all these basketball programs, I didn't think I would ever see another winless SEC team again in my lifetime. But this is a lesson to never say never, because Missouri has done a really good job of channeling that old Vanderbilt team. They're 0-16, and they get to play the 4th place team in the conference tonight, hosting Auburn at home. Missouri does not have many good chances to avoid that ultimate donut. They got Auburn tonight. They are at LSU on Saturday. Maybe they steal it there. LSU's been inconsistent there, or been inconsistent this season. So maybe they steal one and can snap what would be a 17-game losing streak for Missouri going into that. And then more than likely, I'd say Missouri is a lock to be in last place and be the 14 seed going into the SEC tournament, meaning that they will more than likely play Georgia or Arkansas on the Wednesday of the SEC tournament next week in Nashville. And don't like their chances of beating Georgia. As we've seen, Georgia, when they're clicking and they're playing well, can beat some really good teams, as we saw, like we said, here in Columbia. Arkansas has all the talent in the world, but I don't know exactly how invested they are in their season right now. Funny enough, they end up scoring 102 points at Rupp and still lost by almost double digits. For anybody who got to see that game, there was a whole lot of points. Defense was not just optional. I would say it wasn't even allowed in that game. But Missouri's got 2 chances starting tonight against Auburn to avoid the dreaded 0-18 regular season, and then they'll finish off at LSU. Tomorrow night, a big slate. We'll go ahead and dive into some of those games as well, since Jay and I will not be having a show. Obviously, the Tennessee-South Carolina game is for first place in the conference. That is a massive showdown for many reasons. Other games this week include Mississippi State at Texas A&M. And if we're about to draw out a rooting guide for Gamecock fans, you really want Mississippi State to go to College Station and hit the Aggies where it hurts, because you win that game, Mississippi State has a really good chance of leapfrogging from 32 into the top 30 in the net rankings. And if they're able to jump into the top 30, that makes the win January 6th, earlier this year, a quad 1 victory. You'll take as many of those possible, not because you have any issue getting into the NCAA tournament. You would like to improve your seeding. And it's really cool for us to be sitting here in early March talking about Gamecock men's basketball and improving seeding for the NCAA tournament, but that's the situation they find themselves in right now. They could really improve that if Mississippi State wins, and then you end your regular season with a win in Starkville. All of that incredibly possible. Georgia's taking on, looks like Ole Miss tonight. This is going to be in Athens. Ole Miss needs this win desperately. We want to talk about SEC teams that are on the bubble. They have pretty much played themselves onto it after an incredible non-conference slate. As of right now, Joe Lunardi does not have the Ole Miss Rebels in the tournament. And I don't believe Jerry Palm does either, because they don't necessarily have a resume that you would feel great about moving forward. A really bad net ranking. They're outside the top 75 in net, which is almost like a kiss of death for teams trying to get an at-large. They only have 2 quad 1 wins this season, and they're 5-9 in quads 1 and 2. It's pretty rough considering that their non-conference slate was 13-0 and had wins against teams like NC State and Memphis, which early in the season, those two games were considered pretty big wins. But since those victories, NC State has fallen to 17-13. They will not be playing in the NCAA tournament. Memphis has fallen off a bleeping cliff ever since their early run. I think you could almost pinpoint their fall after the Clemson game. That win hasn't helped their resume at all because Memphis has fallen down to 71 in the net ranking. So Ole Miss desperately can't take a loss against Georgia. It looks like they might have to win the SEC to see themselves announced on Selection Sunday. Wrap up today's show, talk a little bit about tomorrow's game, and revisit the poll question from earlier in the show as the postgame show concludes. Coming up here in just about 11 minutes or so, 11 and a half minutes, Carolina Calls with Coach Lamont Paris and the voice of the Gamecocks, Derek Scott, who was on with me in the second hour. If you go back and listen to that, you can on our podcast page or on our app or on the Game TV. Once the live stream finishes, it'll be available for replay. But Carolina Calls will be coming up here just shortly. And for those who are wanting to hear the Gamecock baseball game, that'll be on WISW on the AM station. 6:15 pregame, 6:30 p.m. first pitch. Big game for the Gamecocks tonight to kind of bounce back from the Clemson game. Yeah, Citadel might not be the best of opponents you play this year, but this is a good opportunity to get back and get some confidence underneath your belt. Looks like Eddie Copper is going to be on the mound today. 1-0 on the season with 7 strikeouts, 4 walks, an ERA of 1 flat, walks, hits per innings pitch of 1. And the batting order has been released. According to Stat Broadcast, it will be Dylan Brewer in the leadoff spot, followed by Talmadge LaCroix, Ethan Petrie, Cole Messina, Kennedy Jones, Parker Nolan, Tyler Causey, Gavin Casas, and Will Tippett rounding out the lineup. We'll go ahead. Speaking of the Carolina baseball team, that was the focus of today's poll question of the day. Trying to catch, I guess, maybe the temperature of the fan base after getting swept by Clemson over the weekend. Kept it pretty simple. We asked, what's the biggest takeaway from the Carolina-Clemson baseball series? 1, you left too many on base. 2, the pitching was a surprise. 3, concerned by the sweep. And then lastly, encouraged despite the sweep. 76.6%, a resounding majority, voted that they left too many on base. And that's going to be the highlight of the weekend. We're going to look back, in a month or so when reflecting on the season leading into the postseason and think you could have really helped to get 2 wins against a top 10 team if you just didn't strand 22 runners in 2 games. That's the thing that stings. And it's not just that it was to Clemson, not just that it was 2 close 1-run games against a top 10 team, which is a fantastic opportunity in a non-conference part of your schedule that where that was the highlight of the non-con schedule, but leaving too many runners on is the highlight of it. 234 votes, so a big sample size here. 14.5% of the voters say they're concerned by the sweep. 4.3% said they're encouraged despite the sweep, and 2.6% says that the pitching was a surprise. I'm kind of maybe a little surprised that there's a steep difference between concerned by sweep and encouraged despite the sweep, that it's a 10-point or percentage point difference. I know that obviously that the result isn't what you want, but I thought the Gamecocks played pretty well. I thought they pitched well enough to win both games in the series, just maybe not as opportunistic in their hitting, and that's one thing that Mark Kingston told me yesterday on the show, that is a key emphasis when they get back to the drawing board. And I thought that, Donnie hit it pretty well in terms of asking, maybe why, why they didn't hit well situationally. Donnie said, my biggest takeaway for me was inability to put good at-bats together when they mattered. Call it hitting approach or hitting style, but you have to get base hits sometimes and not try and drive every swing over the wall. Take what's given. So that was Donnie on Twitter. So an interesting look at to maybe see where the fan base is at after a disappointing series and 2 close losses to Clemson. Tomorrow night at CLA, Derek agreed with me. This is the biggest game, maybe biggest Gamecock men's basketball game in the history of Colonial Life Arena. Well, I guess we'll throw that caveat out because CLA has hosted some men's NCAA tournament games, and I like to, one of my favorite NCAA tournament games is that Duke-UCF thriller in the second round a few years ago, that UCF was a missed layup away from pulling off a stunning upset when that game was played at CLA. But tomorrow night's big. It's the ranking of Tennessee. It's the SEC title that's on the line. It's the Gamecocks being in real contention of an SEC title. It's being televised nationally. This is a huge opportunity against a team that you surprised in Knoxville. You took them by surprise a little bit. You beat them by 4, held them to 59 points on their home floor. They did not play very well, but you made sure that they didn't play very well. It was Tennessee's worst their worst 3-point game shooting is like the 3rd worst effective field goal shooting game. And in order to pull off another upset, I think you're just going to have to crash the glass offensively. Tennessee forces an incredibly high percentage of turnovers, the best in the SEC, and they have the lowest effective field goal percentage of opponents in the SEC. Teams don't shoot very well against Tennessee, and overall, you didn't shoot the lights out at Thompson Bowling. But you got to be able to create second chance opportunities. If there is I don't want to say a weakness, because there's really not a weakness with this Tennessee defensive unit, but there are some things they're not as good at as others. One of those things is defensive rebounding. You've already shown that you can compete with two of the best offensive rebounding teams and overall rebounding teams in college basketball in Texas A&M and Florida. You beat both of them. You can maybe exploit something by creating second chances. You're not going to shoot the ball at 70%. I doubt it. Watch me say that and watch them follow up by actually shooting 70%. But if you crash the glass against Tennessee really well and you get to the line 30 times like you did against Florida, I think you have a really good chance to shock the world. Carolina Calls, Coach Lamont Paris and Derek Scott coming up next.